you today and to have the opportunity to moderate this fantastic panel on narcofeminism. This panel is part of a webinar, our monthly webinar entitled Confronting the Drug War, Harm Reduction and Drug Policy. And this is a section 6 dedicated to narcofeminism. So this webinar is hosted by National Urban Survivor Union, Yale University, UCLA, Drug Policy Alliance, and the program, the social drugs, social science and society at the School of Advanced Studies in the Social Science. So I have the pleasure to introduce very briefly our presenters today. So I have the pleasure to be with Priscilla Gadela, Judy Chang, Katie Simon, and Faye Denis. And we will begin with a short introduction of each of our panelists. I will give the floor to each of them. And I will give the floor to Priscilla first. And Priscilla, can you briefly introduce yourself and give us very briefly some words about your connection with narcofeminism?
Olá, boa tarde. Sou Priscilla Gadela, diretamente de Recife, Pernambuco, Brasil. E minha relação com o narcofeminismo, como é colocado aqui, é que eu sou uma das cofundadoras da Rede Nacional de Feministas Antiproibicionistas, que são mulheres que trazem mulheres dissidências, homens, pessoas cis, trans, não binárias, de uma nova política de drogas a partir de um olhar da América Latina. Então, também nos relacionamos com os países em nossa volta e com todo o continente. Prazer estar aqui.
Thank you, Priscilla. We are also happy to have you on the panel. So I will give the floor now to Judy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Judy Chang. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the executive director of the International Network of People Who Use Drugs. I've been in this role since 2017 and also the first woman to hold this post. So in talking about my connections or experience with narcofeminism, so basically I first heard about narcofeminism when I was invited to, I think what was then the second inaugural kind of gathering of narcofeminism, and that was organized by Eurasian Harm Reduction Association, Eurasian Network of People Who Use Drugs, and Metzeneris in Barcelona. And I think that kind of sprung from, this delegation of women who use drugs that attended the feminist conference AWID the year prior. So yeah, it was really cool, I guess, to be part of, some of those, beginnings, right, of narcofeminism. And then since then, I've been publishing blogs and book chapters about narcofeminism, basing my writing on the feminist belief and slogan about the personal is political, which was always, this challenge to the public versus private and the logical versus emotional divide. And, I think in my writing, I was trying to find ways to bridge, this artificial divide between my personal private life, that is drug use, and, this more kind of public facing life.
Thank you, Judy. And you, Katie, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Katie Simon, she, her. So I'm a member of the COVID-19 and Substance Use Data Collaborative. But I'm also a leadership team member of National Survivors Union, the National Drug Users Union, and executive staff in 2 of its affiliate groups. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Whose Corner Is It Anyway, which is a Western Mass group by and for low-income sex workers who use drugs. And I'm the director of narrative development at North Carolina Survivors Union. And what being the director of narrative development means, among other things, is that I lead Narcofeminism Story Share, which is a group process for autobiographical story development with cis and trans women and non-binary people who use drugs specifically, but all people who use drugs more generally, to disrupt stereotypes about our lives. So using group structural analysis, reflective practices, and collaborative story development and editing, we aim to heal our self-stigma. We also utilize these stories in trainings with healthcare and service providers to confront their stigma against people who use drugs. And ultimately, these stories are part of the battle to eliminate systemic forces which foster inequity and harm people who use drugs. And this process is also built really firmly on a narco-feminist theoretical foundation, as first defined by Awid and the writers of the Barcelona Statement, who Judy just mentioned. And it's a process in which we celebrate the feminisms of women who use drugs, as well as that of all people who use drugs.
Thank you, Kathy. Faye, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much for having me. It's such a privilege to be amongst these amazing activists, and I feel like a bit of an imposter because I'm a researcher rather than an activist. But yeah, I think I've been kind of working in the vein of narco-feminism for a while without really realizing it. Kind of thinking about trying to complicate and diversify the stories that we tell around drug use, particularly drawing on people's kind of lived experiences. But it was actually in 2019 that I was introduced to the term by a narco-feminist activist living in London who had participated in this meeting that Judy mentioned in Barcelona. And she was kind of completely inspired by this term. And for me, it was like putting drugs and feminism together where they're often kept apart. And I was also really kind of inspired by this term, like this, this praxis. Then with some colleagues, Kieran Paneer from Deakin University in Australia and a fellow colleague from my department, the Department of Sociology at Goldsmiths, we decided to do some more kind of research in the area and interviewed some of these founding activists from Central Asia and Eastern Europe for a book project where we're kind of looking at what narco-feminism can mean for our discipline of sociology, and it brings together activists and researchers in this book, and Mary and Judy are kindly part of it as well. So it's really nice to be on this call. Thank you.
So thank you, Faye. I'm so happy to be with you today, and narco-feminism is so inspiring perspective. And I will not be a presenter today, but I will also thank a French group I work with at ASUD Marseille and Le Tipi, a group of women users who are embedded in narco-feminism, and I learned a lot from them. So that's also very important for me to thank them and to give to have the opportunity today to mention their name. So I will now give the floor to Judy, and I have a question, Judy, for you. How do you define narco-feminism? We can't hear you.
Mute. Yes, just following on from what Faye was saying about, feminism and kind of the drug user rights movement, being kept quite separate. And I think, what's really important about narco-feminism, is that it's able to merge, the two worlds, that of drug user liberation and feminism, and really when we look at the two, I think, they should have really been natural allies from the beginning. At their essence, they're both really about bodily autonomy and fighting against other people, primarily those with more power, telling us what to do with our bodies. If we look at the women's movement, the feminist movement, it's been a struggle for, say, the right to abortion, the right to work, the right to political participation, and about fighting against violence and discrimination in both the public and private spheres, amongst, many other fights. For people who use drugs, similarly, it's about the fight for freedom, for bodily autonomy and cognitive liberty, the right to found a family, and also about fighting back against violent discrimination, and of course, political participation, which a lot of the times, we're denied that. But, I think also with narco-feminism, what we've recognized is, the drug user movement has been quite male dominated and hasn't always taken into account the ways in which gender inequality, has specific impacts on our lives as women who use drugs. It has tended to erase, you know, us and our experiences. So I think narcofeminism is about, you know, addressing all of the above and, you know, really pulling out, you know, these inequities and inequalities. And I think just as feminists and other non-conforming identities, such as sex workers and transgender women, have been seen as bad women, women who use drugs have also been seen, you know, as fallen women. So I think, you know, our identities have always been, you know, made for us. As Katie was saying before, you know, there's so many stereotypes out there about women who use drugs. And, you know, these stereotypes are made because they serve others, right? You know, just throughout history, as women have been portrayed as weak because men need to be seen as strong. You know, women who use drugs are made out to be, you know, disordered because others need to feel in control, right? And have, you know, a group of people to help. So narcofeminism is not only a framework, I think, to think through these interlinkages and interconnections between movements. You know, I think what we're really looking towards as well is that, you know, it's becoming a movement in and of itself, and it can become a movement in and of itself, you know, led by women who use drugs and allies who are fighting back against the war on drugs and oppression, you know, in all its forms. And that includes, you know, often from you know, mainstream feminists in some ways, you know, have tended to sideline and ignore women who use drugs. So I think, you know, it's acted as a banner for women who use drugs, you know, to come out, to find solidarity with each other, to find this common narrative, to collectively commit, you know, to shrug off the oppressive shame, the self-stigma that Katie was talking about before, you know, to shrug that off and find pride in our histories and our shared experiences. I think it's also about celebrating strength and resilience, you know, that can come about because of one's drug use, and because, you know, resilience in the face of criminalization, and, you know, really being able to be open about that as well. You know, I think, you know, in lots of writings about narcofeminism as well, it's about the right to seek pleasure, whilst also asserting, you know, the right to numb and regulate pain if we wish. You know, at the end of the day, it's about, you know, the fact that it's our bodies and we should own our bodies and we should have the ultimate say over, you know, what we do with our bodies as women who use drugs in all our diversity.
Thank you, Judy. And Faye, for you, how do you define narcofeminism?
Yeah, I think there's kind of like a more yeah, I think there's a kind of what Judy's like there's kind of I think it's good to, so I think there's, sorry, I'm not making much sense, but there's kind of like the narcofeminism with the capital N, and I think that's very much rooted in activism, like activist definitions of narcofeminism. I think a lot of that can be found in the Barcelona Declaration that came out of the meeting of women who use drugs and advocates for women who use drugs, but also in the book that I just mentioned, we kind of broaden it out a little bit to think about more broadly, like thinking about drug consumption practices as feminist practices. And I really like Judy's definition of narcofeminism when she talks about it as an ethics of care. And I think it's kind of like a way of doing and being that acknowledges the way that drug control systems can disproportionately oppress women and gender diverse people, but how women and gender diverse people who use drugs also challenge these frames and work to build better worlds. So I think it's always about doing these two things, about acknowledging the oppression that happens, but also the ways that women and gender diverse people are living with drugs to create better worlds as well. So it's like being able to see these two things together, like not just acknowledging the oppression and then thinking of women as passive kind of victims, but also thinking of the ways that the creative kind of innovative ways that women are living with drugs outside these kind of restrictive confines of addiction. And I do see like addiction is a very much gendered and as well as racialized and classed kind of construct, and the addict of the figure is gendered as well. So yeah, it's kind of doing both those things.
Thank you, Faye. Yes, this question of ethics of care is really, really important, and the question of prohibition too. I think that prohibition is also something that is very central around narcofeminism, and that's why also narcofeminism came from women, but can also be very useful for all people who use drugs and who are oppressed by prohibition. Priscilla, I have now a question for you, and I will try to speak slowly for the interpreter. So the question is, how have feminism traditionally excluded women who use drugs, and how does the specific criminalization and marginalization of women who use drugs necessitate the creation of narcofeminism?
Ficou bem claro. Acho que primeiro, eu acho que o feminismo, ele, assim como as diversas outras políticas, afastam as mulheres e pessoas que usam drogas por conta do processo da proibição, mas por conta do processo de opressão global, quando entende que a política de drogas é a forma mais objetiva e direta de opressão, já que o mercado e trânsito e sequestro de pessoas negras havia acabado. E aí isso faz com que outra estratégia precise ser colocada em pauta para controlar, principalmente aqui nós, povos da América Latina, que fomos colonizados, tivemos um genocídio indígena, tivemos um sequestro da população negra, que aqui no Brasil é o país onde se tem mais negros fora da África. Então, aqui o processo da proibição está diretamente atrelado ao processo de opressão dos corpos da população negra e indígena, e que, com a política de drogas, provocada a partir da lógica dos Estados Unidos e dos governos anteriores, inclui brancos pacifistas, e isso se amplia de uma forma ainda maior na forma de opressão e segregação. Né? Então, a proibição ela acaba sendo esse lugar de manutenção do afastamento das pessoas, e o estigma ser o espaço que limita a nossa potencialidade. Né? Então, a reunião de nós, feministas, aqui chamamos feministas antiproibicionistas, acabamos de sair de um encontro com várias mulheres do Brasil, que é continental, e da América Latina, onde pautamos, sim, uma nova ética de cuidado, como você bem trouxe agora há pouco, Marie, para toda a sociedade, não apenas para as mulheres e pessoas de diversos formatos, mas para toda a sociedade. Nós estamos rompendo o estigma e construindo política pública, construindo fazer, cuidando, ampliando formas. Então, eu acho que essa é a forma que a gente vem entendendo que é necessário, sim, uma visão a partir das mulheres e corpos dissidentes para ruptura da proibição das drogas, que para nós aqui ela é mortal e tenebrosa todos os dias. Vivemos uma barbárie aqui no Brasil, com um sistema carcerário lotado de mulheres e diversos grupos dentro dos presídios, o que afasta, e colocados no lugar de usuários de drogas ou de traficantes, uma lei que só defende proibição, asilamento, tutela, não permite outras formas de cuidado. Então, o nosso nascimento é uma tentativa de dizer assim, nós não vamos morrer, nós não vamos ser objetos de pesquisa, nós somos as pesquisadoras, nós somos o local de teoria, nós somos as pessoas que precisam ser escutadas e pautarem a política pública. E aí a gente entende que esse lugar não é de um grupo, mas sim de uma junção. Então, a Renfa é o espaço onde tem mulheres negras, brancas, indígenas, pessoas transexuais, travestis, não binárias, diversos corpos de dissidência, mas na luta em um lugar de trazer à tona a nossa realidade a partir da proibição e das diversas violações que a gente vive por esse modelo de guerra às drogas, legitimando, assim, uma série de desigualdades, desamparo e muitos traumas. Então, é uma rede que a gente primeiro vem, acho que Kate que falou sobre isso, de nos curar em coletivo e em grupo, para poder trazer à tona nossa potência e nosso lugar de construção.
Thank you, Priscilla. The same question to you, Katie.
Yes. Stick with me here. Just as Priscilla just put this in a Brazilian and anti-colonialist context, I'm going to put it into a US history context, perhaps over broadly. What we have to remember here is that first wave feminism in the 19th century began as an ideology for white, middle, and upper class women. And from the very beginning, that ideology was racist, classist, anti-sex work, puritanical, and prohibitionist. About 100 years ago, white women won the franchise in this country at the same time as feminists lobbied successfully for alcohol prohibition. And now in some ways that was a misguided attempt to combat domestic violence and economic deprivation in families, but we can't ignore the classism of prohibitionist rhetoric, which condemned and lampooned the drinking of the working classes. So in the settlement house mentality of first wave feminism, women like me who use drugs and trade sex were the undeserving poor, worthy of the paternalistic care of white, middle, and upper class women if we were willing to better ourselves at best, and fitting targets for criminalization and eugenicism at worst. I think it's also really important, speaking of settlement houses, to remember that social services as we know them have a lot of the philanthropy of upper class white women in the 19th century and early 20th century baked into them. So the stigmatization and othering of poor people, including women who use drugs and trade sex, coercion and paternalism as care, the diversion of people in the lumpen proletariat into unsustainable minimum wage jobs as a means to teach us humility, and to a certain extent, the separation of families, especially Indigenous and Black families. All of this came to us from the same milieu that birthed first wave feminism. And so in these ways, feminism has historically excluded and punished women who use drugs, while also excluding intersectional identities, which many communities of women who use drugs belong to. And all of these themes continued into second wave feminism, which we know aggressively excluded women of color and working class women. And many of today's feminisms have continued along this vein. For instance, we've allowed violently transphobic, so-called gender critical feminism to flourish in the United States and the UK. Carceral anti-sex work feminists have furthered the criminalization of sex work and made the conditions of its labor more dangerous, especially for the most marginalized sex workers, among them sex workers who use drugs, through end-demand policies of criminalizing clients. And in the meantime, people defined as women by the carceral system are the fastest growing population in jails and prisons. And there was a 475% increase in the number of women incarcerated in the US between 1980 and 2019. And many of these people were incarcerated for drug crimes. And yet today's feminisms still continue to view the issues of women and other people who use drugs as niche issues at best. Family separation, the threat of fetal assault laws, the fact that in 24 states and Washington, D.C., substance use in and of itself is considered child abuse, are issues which aren't prioritized by reproductive justice movements, for instance. And where are mainstream rape crisis movements when we talk about the targeting of women and other people who trade sex and use drugs, especially women and people of color, for police sexual assault, which was uncovered on a massive scale, for instance, in a 2016 Department of Justice investigation of the Baltimore City Police Department. Feminist movements continue to deprioritize policy issues which have life and death stakes for women and other people who use drugs.
So thank you so much, Priscilla and Katie, for highlighting also the topic of social class, post-colonialism, that is very important in narcofeminism. I also want to highlight that in the narcofeminism history, even if it's a short history, women from Eastern Europe and from Eastern Europe movements play also a major role in narcofeminism movement. And I see that some of them are here with us today, and I'm happy to know that we are here together from different parts of the world. So the third question that I want to discuss with you today is, how do you practice narcofeminism in your work? So I will give the floor to Priscilla on this topic. So Priscilla, how do you practice narcofeminism?
Acho que o primeiro ponto é da gente reconhecer que a gente vai incomodar, que o que a gente fala vai mexer com nossos diversos espaços e grupos, e a prática do feminismo antiproibicionista que a gente vem construindo, que pode ser lido como narcofeminismo, é de estar ampliando a forma e olhar das pessoas, dos diversos corpos, do fazer da política, do fazer da pesquisa, do fazer, enfim, das diversas ferramentas que nós podemos adquirir ao longo da vida, e como transformar esse lugar que Bell Hooks fala do amor enquanto ação, não enquanto sentimento. Então, transformar isso em ação para que essas realidades e vivências tenham rotas mudadas por acessar pessoas, espaços, grupos, oportunidades, e de construírem uma vida, e de terem um lugar de direito, não apenas a partir do estigma. Então, se reconhecerem, sim, a partir desse lugar, por exemplo, de usuários de droga, mas não só esse, todos os outros que nós possamos ter, com uma prática, e aí eu vou falar muito em prática, porque eu acho que essa é a forma que a gente da Renfo vem construindo, apesar de construir muitos materiais, documentos, mas a nossa linha de frente de forma de pensar e de agir são com as mulheres diretamente afetadas pela guerra às drogas, e como tornar essas mulheres fora daquela única visão que elas poderiam ter na vida, como se aquele fosse o único caminho, e ampliar esse lugar. E fazer esse lugar da ação, porque ele vai exigir da gente romper, mudar, se inquietar, sair mexida, mexer com entranhas. A gente está falando de uma estrutura muito perversa a partir da realidade das mulheres, né? A legitimidade da guerra às drogas, da tentativa de controlar nossos corpos, ele vem desde sempre, desde que o patriarcado se instala e se coloca como alternativa de sociedade e vem excluindo e vem pautando nossas formas. Então, a nossa ruptura enquanto narcofeministas, enquanto feministas antiproibicionistas, também é um lugar de dizer assim, nós não somos apenas um único modelo de mulher, somos mulheridades, temos diversas formas de existir e coexistir. E essa forma a gente vai estar construindo no cotidiano. A gente vai ter a oportunidade de construir materiais institucionais, mas na prática da vida a gente vai construindo materiais que são possíveis de vida, utilizando isso nas diversas formas. Se eu for alguém que tem acesso à justiça, eu vou andar por lá. Se eu for alguém que tem acesso à academia, eu vou andar por lá. Mas se eu for uma mulher em situação de rua, se eu for uma profissional do sexo, se eu for uma pessoa soropositiva, enfim, dos diversos formatos onde eu posso existir, uma pessoa transexual, professora da rua, cabeleireira, os diversos formatos que essa pessoa possa ter, mas que essa pessoa se reconheça tão igual quanto qualquer outra, e tão forte quanto qualquer outra, e tão resistente quanto qualquer outra, e sobrevivente também de um modelo que tenta nos limitar e nos segregar. Então, eu acho que a forma da gente praticar é com amor em ação, e essa ação ela vai exigir da gente, muitas vezes, mudanças em nossas formas de reconhecer, de olhar e de agir. Acho que a prática ela vai ser muito ampliada, e se eu fosse colocar, acho que do meu modelo da minha vida, seria de como eu atuo na prática clínica, já que eu sou psicóloga, como eu fortaleço a escola livre de redução de danos, que é onde eu trabalho, que eu faço um trabalho diretamente com as pessoas usuárias de drogas, mas como eu construo um movimento social, como eu faço parte da academia, dos espaços de trabalhadores das diversas áreas que eu ocupo também, enfim, ampliando, sendo isso a ação.
Thank you, Priscilla. I have the same question for you, Judy. How do you practice narcofeminism?
Thanks. I was just catching up on the chat and seeing all the community that are here, which is great. Yeah, I think, I've always been, now that I know of narcofeminism, I feel like I've always been a narcofeminist, or been practicing it long before I ever, of course, knew the term existed, or before it was created, by women who use drugs in the ECA region. And I say this because I think, at the essence, it is about pushing back against society's ideas of what a woman should be in narcofeminism. And, I feel like I've done this in that, I'm sure as many of us here have, always questioned the role, that society has assigned to us. And I think, drug use and alcohol use was a way of expressing rebellion against, gender norms, this idea that, women don't have the same right to pleasure or, risk-taking as men, risk-taking in quotation marks. And, I think it's also about recognizing, and I have recognized that, there are real positives that come from drug use as well. And there's, a power in there to also reshape ourselves, through drug use that we don't often acknowledge. And I think narcofeminism, is about, reframing that narrative, seeing the whole complexity, of drug use, not just seeing it as pejorative and, in the negative light. So I think coming out publicly as a person who uses drugs, and of course joining the wider drug user rights movement, is an example of practicing narcofeminism. There already aren't that many of us in the world. There needs to be, more of us who feel comfortable and, will be safe in being able to come out about our drug use. And I think, narcofeminism is about, pushing back against the war on drugs, advocating on behalf of and with, criminalized communities, around the world, despite the fact that we are coming from, a social and political, back foot. I think, the women who founded drug user-led networks, or who were involved in, founding networks around the world, including Input, I'm thinking, Jude Byrne, Jenny Kelsell, Annie Madden, I think are the original narcofeminists, before we had a name. Narcofeminism did start from within the community. And I think, it can draw from earlier generations, but I also think in looking forwards, it's always about, how do we kind of build this movement, and how do we encourage others to join and also spark, newer generations. And I think this is part of, the continuing work of narcofeminism that we're always practicing.
Thank you, Judy. Yes, that's very important also to go back to history and to give the name of all these inspiring women who are very important in the movement, even if it was not named as is before. So Katie, I also would like to have your perspective about how do you practice narcofeminism?
So I'll just talk a little bit about our project, Narcofeminism Story Share at North Carolina Survivors Union, as one way of practicing narcofeminism. We practice narcofeminism by creating authentic, nuanced narratives about our lives as women and other people who use drugs. And as we started creating these stories together, we realized what a gap we were filling. Most of us had never seen ourselves truly represented in any piece of media. So drawing here on Judy's theoretical work, I'd say that women who use drugs are excluded both from traditional heteronormative constructions of femininity, because we're seen as selfishly rejecting caretaking roles and family obligations to pursue pleasure, but we're also excluded from feminist models because we're seen as victims of biological compulsion who can't embody, quote, empowered feminism. So what representations of women who use highly criminalized drugs, and especially of women who use drugs and trade sex, are we left with in our culture? We're disposable. The dead drug-using hooker stashed in the trunk of a car is not a tragedy, but a punchline. We're too abject to even have countercultural credibility, like other criminals do in popular media. So hearing each other's stories where we can see each other as autonomous agents, as full human beings with complicated lives is key. I mean, in some ways, Narcofeminism Story Share is a consciousness-raising project that harkens back to the consciousness-raising circles of 70s feminism. When the project began, we realized that for many of us, our internalized stigma was so great, and we were so used to trading in the narratives of abstinence-based treatment in order to navigate authority figures like CPS workers, probation officers, and methadone clinic counselors, that telling our stories, some of us would say things like, you know, it's a good thing they took my kids, or going to prison saved my life. Participating in group structural analysis and universalization of each other's experiences so we can move from individual level to systemic analysis of our lives has been so vital. And I can't emphasize how entrenched that internalized stigma can be, even for those of us who have been drug user organized for decades. For instance, in the reproductive harm reduction module we did around the issues of pregnant and parenting people who use drugs, one of us told a story of overdosing shortly after she put her child to bed. For her, this was a story that shamed her, the narrative that proved that she was a bad mother. But the rest of us listening to it heard something else. We were able to point out to her the way that she had lavishly painted her child's room, the way she participated in a bedtime ritual of singing and telling her stories every night, the way that she was a good mother. I also want to say before I finish answering this question that our process is not just for cis and trans women and non-binary people. We've worked on different modules with all genders of people who use drugs. We finally started planning a narcofeminism story share masculinities model to help men who use drugs unpack the toxic masculinities that criminalization and the carceral system help create. I mean, so just to sum up, the drug war, and specifically the drug war against women and all marginalized genders, pervades our culture. It is, you know, the water that we swim in. In order for us to truly become free, to truly practice narcofeminism, we're going to need culture projects to counter these representations.
Thank you, Katie. By hearing you, it comes to my mind that narcofeminism is also a way to change media imaginaries about women who use drugs, because women who use drugs, but that's also the case for men who use drugs, are always reduced to individual testimonies about weakness, about guilty, and that's super important to have all these narco-feminist stories and all this narco-feminism action, collective action to change these imaginaries in media, but also in the area of drug treatment too, because these imaginaries are very, very present. So I have now a question for Faye. So Faye, how can we further incorporate narco-feminism principles into our work? So in research, for example.
Yeah, just listening to Katie, yeah, well, that's like what she's saying is that's 100% right. Yeah, completely agree that it's about shifting the narratives that can be told around women who use drugs and gender diverse people that use drugs. And research can, yeah, add to this by helping to tell these different stories. And kind of intervene in those narratives that stigmatize and oppress. So this might be about looking at the pleasure and desire or care, for example. And I think this does get really well described in the in what Katie was this story share project that Katie was involved in with the Urban Survivors Union. And there's some really, really, really moving and like amazing examples in that project. And in the book that I mentioned that I've been part of on narcofeminism's revisioning drug use, there's a great chapter by Lou Asbell, and she gives this example of how sexualized drug use has helped form new modes of care and connection during the COVID lockdowns in Berlin that disproportionately affected queer communities. So it's, yeah, how women and gender diverse people are part of these new kind of kinship relationships. So, and also I think like for a researcher, it's very much about constantly adding weight to the fact that our drug laws and treatment structures and modes of knowing drugs and drug disorders operate as like gendered as well as racialized and class forms of social control. So always adding weight to that fact. So then it makes it as difficult as possible for those in power to deny it. Yeah, so telling these different stories, always adding weight to the ways that drug laws and stuff work as modes of social control, but also I think it's about recognizing these adversities that that women are existing in, like with drug use, but also I think I've already said this, but kind of like also giving weight to the modes of survival that always engaged in. So to see and like rally against the violence and suffering, but without eclipsing the power and agency of women who use drugs and their creativity. And adding weight to this through our accounting and modes of representation, which people have already talked about, for the forms of living and care and connection they're forging. So I guess it's also like this kind of rehumanizing project of like people that have been denied the category of human, and there's been a lot of dehumanizing that's gone on that Katie and Judy and others have spoken about. So yeah, thinking about, and this is what one of the narco-feminists from Eastern Europe that we spoke to said about in our work. She wanted us to show the human face of this unpopular problem. So it's about humanizing women who use drugs and giving space and acknowledgement of their care practices.
Thank you, Faye. By hearing you and by also reading the Q&A and the chat, it's really, I think that it's very important to highlight how narco-feminism came from women, and this fight came from the power of women, but can be also expanded to trans, non-binary people and also to men, because yes, as we just discussed, the question of narco-feminism is very tightly linked to prohibition, and all people are oppressed by prohibition. And that's very interesting and inspiring to see how powerful women can also help all the fight against prohibition by a diversity of people who are oppressed. So I also think by hearing you, Faye, that narco-feminism is a unique way to build a bridge between research, experience, and collective action. And that's also a new way for working together and for producing new way of thinking about drug use linked to pleasure and not only linked to guilt. So I will now take some question from the Q&A, and we have a first question that I will ask to all of you. The first question is, what opportunities does the narco-feminism concept present to build anti-carceral solidarity with women involved in the production and supply of drugs? So who wants to answer to this question?
Yeah, I can. Well, I think, the very principle of narco-feminism, is about building solidarity around, women and gender diverse, people that have been impacted negatively by the war on drugs. And that includes, women that produce drugs, women that sell drugs. And I think that has been highlighted in some statements, but perhaps, there needs to be more work done in building, solidarity or linkages, with networks, right? Sometimes I think, there's geographical boundaries, of course, language, but I think, we just all need to do a better job in building those linkages, because we're all connected and we're being impacted, by the same, the same policy failure that is the war on drugs. So I would just say that on that piece.
Katie, do you have something to add?
Yeah, sure. Just quickly. I think that really attacking the drug user, drug seller binary, even in a domestic context, is new to just this decade, right? And I think that a more global solidarity with people who are growing and supplying drugs, you know, people of all genders, is you know, a very new concept to most of the drug policy world. And I think, you know, there are harm reductionist women like Zara Snap, who was on an earlier panel in this series, who are doing incredible work on that issue, and, you know, discussing in their research work how these systems could be created to benefit, you know, both people who, you know, grow and distribute drugs and people who use drugs. But I really think we're at the very beginning of such a global movement, and, you know, especially to applying a narco-feminist lens to it. And I hope that work builds on itself.
Priscilla, do you want to add something about how, what are the opportunities, what opportunities does the narco-feminism concept present to build anti-carceral solidarity with women involved in the production and supply of drugs?
Acho que sim, na nossa experiência aqui, essas mulheres somos nós, de formas diferentes, em lugares diferentes, em momentos diferentes. Como temos uma realidade dentro da proibição, podemos estar nesse lugar a qualquer momento. Nossas atividades aqui, elas vão pautar desde a saída de mulheres de presídios, onde tem um dia que sai, uma vez por semana, que sai uma quantidade, e elas ficam largadas sem nenhum tipo de assistência. Então, quem acaba fazendo isso são os nossos grupos feministas, antiproibicionistas. Aqui no Brasil, a gente conseguiu, ao longo do tempo, um lugar junto aos diversos movimentos feministas. Então, a pauta da proibição hoje faz parte da rede de mulheres negras, da articulação negra, da articulação de mulheres brasileiras, enfim, a gente ampliou esse lugar, inclusive da redução de danos, que alguém falou agora há pouco, sobre direito reprodutivo, enquanto uma alternativa também para a gente poder possibilitar lugares de espaço de cuidado, de ampliar ferramentas. Então, assim, eu acho que a nossa contribuição, primeiro, ela está aqui, nessa sala, nesse momento, quando consegue nos reunir oportunidades, temos muitas, mas o desafio também ele é global. Então, ele vai exigir da gente pensar alternativas e formas diferentes a cada território, mas eu acho que o principal é levar as pessoas a conviverem, a trocarem mais, a reconhecer suas potências, a aprender com suas experiências e a, quem sabe, ter mudanças no repertório de vida diante da impossibilidade que, às vezes, a desigualdade impõe. Então, temos muitas oportunidades, entre elas, eu acho que a redução de danos e o feminismo são os caminhos mais potentes que a gente tem para poder fazer isso no mundo, assim como a pauta racial.
So I have now a final question for of you. So what are the next steps for the narcofeminism movement? So Faye?
Can I let Judy or Katie go first? Because I feel like, yeah, they're more in it.
Judy, Katie?
There's a great book coming out on narcofeminism in September. I'll let Faye talk about that more. But also I just, kind of related to this question, I just put something in the chat. A few speakers have already spoken about the Barcelona Declaration. So that was 2019 and launched at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs that year. So basically that the Barcelona Declaration will be sent out again, you know, to mailing lists, Input, Inward, Metznaris, ERA, Input, And there will just be a short survey attached to it, and it will be like just to ask if it needs to be updated in any way, if we've missed anything in the Barcelona Declaration since time has passed, and also to consult people on potentially like having a global gathering or a global day on narcofeminism, you know. So I think the next step is, you know, really about spreading, you know, the message and also getting more people on board, but also seeing, you know, how we can change from within also, you know, looking at the declaration and, you know, seeing if anything needs to be, you know, adapted for the times.
I think there's still some really basic work that has not been done yet. I mean, like, I feel like harm reduction and drug users union movements are still recovering from being boys clubs until quite recently. You know, most harm reduction programming is still, you know, designed for white straight men who inject opioids. We still don't see enough smaller gauge syringes, which are better suited for the veins of people assigned female at birth. We rarely see childcare offered in harm reduction programming. So many women and other parenting people who use drugs have to forego those services. We still don't see basic reproductive health products for people with uteruses in many harm reduction programs, which is why so many harm reduction programs led by women and non-binary people are making a point to offer tampons, pads, pregnancy tests, Plan B. And like, despite the superlative work of organizations like Movement for Family Power and the Drug Policy Alliance, we still don't see enough emphasis in the drug policy world on fighting for the rights of pregnant and parenting people who use drugs. And harm reduction and drug policy still have issues with incorporating the policy priorities and the needs of sex workers and trafficking survivors into our work, when we know that sex work is an economic survival strategy adopted by so many people who use drugs who aren't white straight men. I mean, like, the solutions are really clear, and it's just using a narco-feminist lens to understand and improve our work as harm reductionists, drug policy workers, and service providers, you know, will make these solutions even clearer at every level of our work.
Priscilla, what are the next steps for the future of narcofeminism?
Acho que, primeiro de tudo, a gente tem uma experiência aqui, que é da sociedade civil. Eu sou feminista, antiproibicionista, redutora de danos, e a gente abriu uma organização, que é a Escola Livre de Redução de Danos, onde a gente tem uma prática a partir do feminismo, a partir do narcofeminismo, onde a gente acolhe crianças, mulheres, construímos outras formas de alternativas diante da redução de danos. Temos, acho que, muitas diferenças nas formas, né, de atuar na redução de danos. Aqui a gente é até criminalizada por fazer ações, vez por outra temos que lidar com a extrema-direita que tenta nos prender, nos processar, mas a gente ainda vem conseguindo fazer. E essa é uma forma que a gente vem construindo de tentar incidir na política pública, de retomar a força da redução de danos, que para a gente aqui ela é central. Foi quem deu possibilidade da gente existir enquanto pessoa que usa droga, enquanto pessoa que pensa, sair do estigma e poder assumir outros lugares na vida. Os nossos próximos passos, eu acho que estamos muito focados na América Latina. Acabamos de ter um encontro nesse final de semana, toda a rede, onde reunimos mais de 100 mulheres de diversos espaços para pautar e atualizar a prática do feminismo antiproibicionista, que vem, sim, tentar romper com o modelo da proibição e construir um novo formato. Mas gostaria muito de indicar o livro de uma companheira daqui, Luana Malheiro, que é Tornar-se uma Mulher Usuária de Crack. Não sei se ele tem tradução, acredito que possa ter só para o espanhol, ele está em português, que é a dissertação de mestrado dela, onde ela acompanhou mulheres usuárias de crack do centro de Salvador, e que, a partir, inclusive, dessa pesquisa, a gente potencializa e consolida a Rede Nacional de Feministas Antiproibicionistas, produzindo o espaço de cuidado a partir desse território, produzindo a pesquisa a partir desse território. Então, a rua sendo esse lugar da gente pensar, pautar e construir. Então, acho que dentro de tudo que a gente pode ter, acho que para a gente é muito importante a redução de danos, enquanto esse lugar de garantia de autonomia, de respeito e de horizontalidade, sendo um caminho muito possível para a gente entrar dentro do feminismo, que foi uma das formas que a gente conseguiu também, mas também da gente se fazer presente dentro desses espaços cada vez com mais de nós, que ainda realmente somos muito poucas, mas temos uma voz estridente e somos sobreviventes. Então, se formos sobreviventes de tanto caos diante da guerra, a gente sobrevive às durezas do movimento, a gente consegue sim. Então, também trazer esse lugar de que a gente precisa, tem muito a fazer, mas precisamos de mais gente, de muitas outras pessoas com a gente.
Thank you, Faye.
Yeah, I hope to carry on building these connections with activists and making more of a case for research to be more political. And we've got a few kind of talks coming up. So I'm just hoping that, yeah, we can just get kind of spread the word more on narcofeminism. And I think it really helps like to have this term and like rallying kind of concept to get around, even though these narcofeminism, like Judy pointed out, has been going on, yeah, for a while. It's good to have this concept, and I think it's a really exciting time for narcofeminism, for narcofeminists. So yeah, I'm excited about the future and continuing to work with activists and draw these connections, build these connections.
Thank you. So thank you so much for all our fantastic panelists, and this was very, very, very inspiring conversation. So all the webinar has been recorded, and if you have registered, you will receive a link about the webinar to listen to it again. And I have also several announcements. So if you want to continue the conversation about narcofeminism, we will have also a conference in Paris from 6 to 8 September, the Contemporary Drug Problems Conference that we dedicate a session on narcofeminism. There is also the special issue from Faye, Karen, and Marsha about narcofeminism that will be published in Sociological Reviews very soon. And at INSHU in Geneva in October, we will also talk about narcofeminism. So we will, as we also receive a lot of papers and documents about narcofeminism in the chat, we will try to send all these documents to the group to be able to build also a community, a large community about narcofeminism. For the end, I would like also to thank Patricia, our interpreter, because I think that language is also an issue for being able to have people from all over the world, and being able not only to speak in English is also something that is part of narcofeminism, to be able to empower all women who use drugs, even those who don't speak English. So thank you, Patricia, for the translation. And thank you so much, Judy, Katie, Priscilla, and Faye, for this fantastic conversation. And we will have our next webinar very soon, and we will inform you by email. Have a good evening, have a good afternoon, or a good morning, according to your time zone. Bye.
Thank you so much. Be well.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, thank you.
Tchau, obrigada, gente.